January 17, 1945. A bitter wind cut through the Ardennes forest. Snow clung to shattered trees, their blackened trunks jutting from the frozen ground like broken rifles. German officers trudged through mud and ice, boots crunching over the remnants of battle. Around them lay the twisted hulks of Sherman tanks, shells riddling armor that had once seemed unstoppable. Smoke still curled from scorched engines, the acrid scent of burning fuel hanging heavy in the air. Lieutenant Colonel Klaus Richter scanned the wreckage, counting the losses with grim precision. 500 tanks gone in days. The landscape was a graveyard of steel and fire, a testament to the ferocity of the American advance. And yet whispers among his men carried an almost impossible truth. These machines would be replaced. By next week, entire regiments of Shermans would roll forward, their guns ready, their crews trained, their supply lines unbroken. Richter's disbelief mirrored that of his fellow officers. They had fought, they had killed, they had taken what should have been victory. And still the Americans, with their endless factories and relentless logistics, refused to yield. Here in the frozen Ardennes, the scale of industrial warfare revealed itself, cold, precise, and utterly unstoppable. A new reality had arrived on the battlefield, one that would change the course of the war. By mid-1944, the tides of World War II had begun to turn unmistakably against Nazi Germany. The Wehrmacht, once feared across Europe, was stretched thin across multiple fronts. In the east, the Red Army pressed relentlessly toward the Reich's borders. In the west, the Allied forces, bolstered by the industrial might of the United States, had stormed Normandy on June 6th and were steadily advancing through France. Germany's defensive lines were crumbling, its reserves depleted, and its high command increasingly desperate. The American approach to war was unlike anything the Germans had encountered. While the Wehrmacht prized technological superiority and tactical ingenuity, the United States leaned heavily on scale, standardization, and speed. Central to this strategy was the M4 Sherman tank. Designed not as a super-heavy breakthrough machine, but as a reliable, mass-producible workhorse, the Sherman embodied the philosophy of the American war effort. Quantity could achieve what precision alone could not. By mid-1944, Detroit, Cleveland, and other industrial hubs were producing hundreds of Shermans every month, churning out tanks faster than German factories could assemble even a single Tiger or Panther. The logistics network supporting this production was staggering. From the assembly lines of the Midwest to the ports of Cherbourg and Antwerp, rail and road convoys carried engines, ammunition, and fuel across thousands of miles. Field depots stocked spare parts, recovery units pulled damaged tanks from the front lines, and repair crews worked around the clock. Even when a Sherman was destroyed, it was not necessarily lost. Many could be repaired and returned to combat within days. Meanwhile, the Germans faced mounting challenges. Their tanks, the Tiger I, Tiger II, and Panther, were technically superior in armor and firepower, but production was slow, costly, and vulnerable to Allied bombing raids. Skilled engineers and laborers were in short supply, and fuel shortages often grounded units even when tanks were available. The contrast between German over-engineering and American industrial pragmatism became increasingly stark. In October 1944, during the advance through France, German intelligence began noting the scale of the American war machine. Field reports described entire battalions of Shermans appearing almost overnight, replacing those lost in previous engagements. Officers like Richter were astonished. How could a nation so far from the front sustain such relentless pressure? The answer lay not in the battlefield tactics alone, but in the vast, humming factories of the United States, places where steel, engines, and human labor were transformed into machines of war with an efficiency that defied imagination. By late 1944, as the winter months approached, German officers would face this reality head-on in the Ardennes. The upcoming offensive, later called the Battle of the Bulge, would test their understanding of war in a world where industrial capacity mattered as much as strategy or courage. The Germans could destroy tanks, hundreds, even thousands, but the Americans had learned to replace them almost as quickly as they were lost. And it was this relentless replenishment, more than any single battle, that would leave German officers stunned. This context, the imbalance between Germany's tactical brilliance and America's industrial scale, set the stage for the shocking moments that would unfold in the Ardennes forests. The battlefield would soon become a stark testament to the limits of human effort against a nation's logistical might. The American industrial advantage was rooted in decades of preparation. Long before the first shots of World War II, the United States had built a vast manufacturing base during the interwar period, with assembly lines perfected for automobiles now repurposed for tanks, trucks, and artillery. By 1944, these factories operated almost continuously, employing hundreds of thousands of workers, men drafted from civilian life, and women who had entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Each Sherman tank that rolled off the line represented not only steel and machinery, but also an entire network of supply chains, raw materials, and human labor coordinated with near-military precision. The Sherman's design reflected this philosophy. Unlike Germany's heavy tanks, which required complex machinery and highly trained crews, the Sherman was simpler to produce, maintain, and operate. Its armor and armament were adequate for most engagements, and while it could be outmatched by a Tiger or Panther in a one-on-one duel, the Sherman compensated with mobility, reliability, and sheer numbers. Each tank could be repaired in the field, and replacement parts were standardized across units. This meant that even after sustaining damage, many Shermans returned to the front within days. Their crews rotated in and out as needed. On the German side, the challenges were mounting. Allied bombing campaigns had destroyed factories, railways, and fuel depots, slowing production and complicating supply lines. Even if a Tiger or Panther could destroy multiple Shermans in a single engagement, Germany simply could not replace losses at the same pace. Skilled labor was stretched thin, resources were scarce, and logistical networks were under constant attack. The Germans had perfected blitzkrieg tactics, but these relied on speed and surprise, increasingly impossible against an enemy who could replace lost units faster than they could be eliminated. By November 1944, as the Allies approached the German border, these industrial realities became impossible to ignore. Reports from the front lines indicated that entire American armored divisions could vanish in battle, only to be reinforced almost immediately. German commanders began to understand a harsh truth. Tactical victories were fleeting if the enemy's strategic depth was limitless. The Ardennes would soon become a proving ground for this lesson. The Battle of the Bulge, which commenced on December 16, 1944, highlighted the stark contrast between the opposing forces. German units achieved surprise, breaking through the thinly held American lines and creating chaos in the initial stages. Tanks, infantry, and artillery clashed in dense forests and snow-covered roads. For a brief moment, it seemed the Germans could exploit their tactical skill to turn the front. Yet behind the scenes, American factories never paused. Spare engines, ammunition, and replacement tanks moved inexorably toward the front, ready to fill every gap the Germans created. Field reports from German officers during these weeks reveal their growing astonishment. One memo, later intercepted by Allied intelligence, described a commander counting the wreckage of Sherman tanks, only to learn that entire new battalions would arrive within days. The Germans were fighting a war not merely against soldiers or machines, but against a relentless industrial tide. This was a battle where numbers, logistics, and production capacity could outweigh strategy, courage, or technological superiority. By January 1945, it became clear that the German army's best tactical efforts were insufficient against the sheer output of the United States. The Ardennes offensive slowed, then stalled. German units were exhausted, undersupplied, and unable to replace losses as rapidly as their adversaries. Meanwhile, American forces, resupplied with newly arrived Shermans and other armored vehicles, regained the initiative, pushing back the German advance and ultimately sealing the failure of the offensive. In this period, the German realization was profound and unsettling. No matter how skillfully they fought, no matter how many tanks they destroyed, the Americans' industrial machine was inexhaustible. The shock of this revelation would echo in German reports, memoirs, and post-war analyses, the moment when human skill met the cold, unyielding power of American logistics and production. This industrial advantage would define the next phase of the war. German officers, once confident in their tactical supremacy, now faced a new and unnerving reality. The battlefield itself was no longer only a contest of strategy and courage. It had become a test of endurance against a nation whose factories could outproduce destruction itself. Behind every Sherman tank on the front line was a story of countless hands in factories thousands of miles away. In Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago, men and women labored in shifts that stretched long into the night. Women, known as Rosie the Riveters, riveted armor plates with precision, welded engines, and assembled tracks under the glare of industrial lights. Each worker understood that their efforts had a tangible impact. A tank they finished today could be rolling through the Ardennes within weeks. Fatigue was constant, injuries were frequent, yet morale remained high, driven by the belief that their work was decisive. Unlike the battlefield, where outcomes were uncertain and death could arrive in an instant, the assembly line offered a controlled, measurable contribution to victory. The human machinery of the U.S. home front, coordinated with military logistics, became as crucial as the soldiers wielding rifles and cannons overseas. At the front, American ingenuity extended beyond production into rapid battlefield repair. Damaged Shermans were not automatically written off. Mobile recovery units moved under the cover of night, dragging tanks from craters and shell-pocked roads to field depots. Repair crews worked with remarkable speed, swapping engines, fixing tracks, and replacing guns. In some cases, a tank hit by a Panther's 80mm shell one day could return to battle within 3 or 4 days. This capability was not merely convenient. It transformed engagements. German officers, observing the battlefield, could not understand how a destroyed tank could vanish from view, only to reappear weeks later in full operational condition. The tactical implication was profound. Numerical superiority was preserved even in the face of intense attrition, denying the Germans the psychological and strategic leverage of their kills. The Sherman tank itself was a study in pragmatic engineering. Unlike the German Panther or Tiger, which emphasized superior firepower and armor at the expense of production speed, the Sherman was designed for mass production and reliability. Its armor was adequate, its gun effective against medium targets, and its mechanical systems were simple enough to allow rapid repair. Standardized parts meant that engines, transmissions, and turrets could be swapped quickly in the field or in depots. The design was not flashy or revolutionary, but it achieved a remarkable goal. It allowed the United States to outproduce and outreplace German tanks by factors of 2 or 3 in critical periods. German commanders, obsessed with technical superiority, often failed to account for the strategic advantage conferred by sheer numbers and maintainability. Behind the tanks and repair crews was a layer of military leadership orchestrating the flow of war materiel. Officers like General Dwight D. Eisenhower, along with logistics experts such as General Brahan Somerville, ensured that production, transportation, and deployment were synchronized. Ports were cleared rapidly, rail lines maintained, and supply depots stocked with precision. The battlefield became an extension of the production system, rather than a separate theater of chaos. Decisions made thousands of miles away in offices and factories translated directly into operational capability at the front. For German officers witnessing this, the concept of strategic depth took on a new meaning. Defeating the enemy required more than battlefield skill. It demanded the destruction of an entire nation's industrial capacity, a task far beyond the Reich's capabilities by late 1944. The German perspective was one of mounting disbelief. Field reports and diaries from officers during the Ardennes offensive describe a repeated pattern. They would tally destroyed Shermans, believing that victory in a localized engagement had been achieved, only to witness new units arriving days later. One officer wrote of counting over 500 tanks destroyed in a single week, only to be informed that the same number would be back at the front before the next engagement. This relentless replenishment undermined morale and fostered a growing sense of futility. German tactics that had worked against less industrialized opponents now seemed almost irrelevant. Every tactical triumph was ephemeral, every kill immediately negated by America's capacity to produce, transport, and repair armored units with astonishing speed. The shock was not merely logistical, it was existential. These officers realized they were facing an enemy whose strength lay not just in strategy or courage, but in the sheer unstoppable output of an entire nation. While the focus often rests on steel and logistics, the human dimension was profound. American soldiers benefited from the ability to rotate units, replace damaged equipment, and sustain operations without pause. Conversely, German soldiers faced increasingly worn-out units, shortages of fuel, and insufficient replacement armor. The disparity in industrial capacity directly affected lives. Where one side could survive, maneuver, and rearm, the other faced attrition compounded by exhaustion and dwindling resources. Factories in the U.S. were not only producing machines, they were indirectly preserving the lives of their crews, ensuring that no single engagement could cripple the force. German officers, observing these dynamics, recognized a grim truth. Industrial warfare was now a moral as well as a strategic instrument. Those who could supply the front consistently had a decisive advantage, both in victory and survival. The U.S. system for replacing tanks combined multiple layers of efficiency. Production schedules were coordinated down to the day. Rail networks delivered units to ports and convoys transported them across liberated France and Belgium. Field depots stocked spare engines, tracks, and guns, allowing immediate repairs close to combat zones. Recovery units ensured minimal downtime for damaged tanks, and train crews were rotated seamlessly from training camps into combat formations. This integration of production, transportation, repair, and personnel rotation created a self-reinforcing system. Loss did not equate to a permanent reduction in strength. German forces, despite localized tactical success, could not replicate such depth. Every engagement highlighted a systemic imbalance. Destruction on one side was countered by rapid replenishment on the other. The battlefield was no longer merely a theater of combat. It had become a stage for demonstrating the power of industrial coordination. The events of late 1944 and early 1945 foreshadowed a fundamental shift in how wars would be waged. Success was no longer determined solely by the valor of soldiers, the ingenuity of commanders, or even the superiority of individual weapons. Industrial capacity, logistics, and the ability to replace material losses became decisive factors. The German officers' shock at the replacement of 500 tanks in a single week highlighted this new reality. It was a lesson that reverberated beyond the Ardennes, signaling the emergence of a war in which nations with superior production and organization could dominate the battlefield over those relying on tactical brilliance alone. This shift marked the rise of modern, system-driven warfare, where human courage and ingenuity were constrained by the scale and efficiency of national industry. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes forest, cloaked in snow and shadow, became the stage for Germany's last major offensive on the Western Front. Operation Wacht am Rhein had begun, catching the thinly held American lines by surprise. Tanks, infantry, and artillery surged through icy roads and frozen villages. For a brief, electrifying moment, German commanders believed the offensive could split the Allied forces, encircle divisions, and force a negotiated settlement. On the ground, Tiger and Panther tanks tore through Shermans, leaving twisted metal and scorched earth in their wake. Field reports from German units recorded extraordinary destruction. Entire battalions of Shermans were annihilated within hours. Officers counted hundreds of tanks lost. The numbers were staggering. Lieutenant Colonel Richter, moving along the front lines, saw firsthand the chaos. Burned-out Shermans blocking roads, infantry scattered, and artillery crews frantically attempting to hold strategic crossroads. Victory, it seemed, was within reach. Yet even in the depths of this apparent triumph, the Americans demonstrated a resilience born not of magic, but of logistics. Commanders at divisional headquarters coordinated the redeployment of replacement tanks from rear depots. Rail lines were cleared under constant threat of attack, and supply convoys braved snow, mud, and artillery fire to bring new Shermans to the front. Recovery teams working through the freezing nights dragged damaged tanks from craters, repairing or cannibalizing them for parts to return machines to service within days. German officers, accustomed to wars where destruction translated directly into advantage, were confronted with a reality that defied expectation. By the time the snow cleared and the initial shock of the German breakthrough settled, reports arrived indicating that the very units they had destroyed were being replaced. Entire regiments of Shermans were again operational, ready to hold the roads, towns, and forested ridges the Germans had temporarily seized. The tactical brilliance of the Wehrmacht, honed through years of blitzkrieg campaigns, collided with the relentless momentum of the American industrial machine. The clash was almost surreal. In the dense Ardennes woods, a tiger could destroy a Sherman, but 10 more would soon roll forward from depots and convoys, their crews trained, their weapons ready, their armor intact. Every kill inflicted by the Germans was temporary. Every tactical gain was fragile. The battlefield, once a place of decisive maneuvers, became a theater of attrition against a logistical juggernaut. By December 22nd, just 6 days into the offensive, German commanders began to sense that the American system was unbreakable. Reports filtered in of additional tank battalions arriving overnight, filling gaps that should have signaled victory. The shock was profound. Officers who had once relied on battlefield prowess as the measure of war now faced an entirely new metric: production speed, repair efficiency, and the depth of national resources. In this crucible of snow, fire, and steel, the true power of the U.S. war machine revealed itself. The Ardennes offensive would continue for weeks, but the turning point had already occurred in the minds of those German officers. They had achieved tactical successes, captured towns, and destroyed hundreds of enemy tanks, yet none of these victories would yield lasting advantage. The Americans' ability to replace 500 tanks in a single week, a feat that would have seemed impossible in any previous war, was now a tangible, demoralizing reality. Germany's finest units, despite bravery and skill, were up against an enemy whose strength lay in relentless, industrial-scale replenishment. The snow-covered forests, the echoing artillery, and the shattered tanks were no longer just symbols of conflict. They had become a testament to an immutable principle of modern warfare. The Germans could fight with skill, courage, and strategy, but in the Ardennes, they confronted an enemy whose advantage could not be destroyed with bullets or shells. By December 23rd, as the counteroffensive began to gather momentum, this realization weighed heavily on every German officer observing the front. The battlefield itself had been transformed, dominated by the sheer scale of production and supply. As the Ardennes offensive wore on into late December 1944, the full extent of America's industrial power became painfully clear to German commanders. Despite initial breakthroughs, every village taken and every road seized was swiftly contested by fresh American armor. By December 26th, reports from the front described entire Sherman battalions, previously thought destroyed, reappearing with crews rotated in and weapons fully operational. The Germans' tactical victories had evaporated almost as quickly as they had been achieved. Field intelligence revealed the staggering efficiency behind these replacements. Tanks arriving at the front had often been completed in Detroit just weeks prior, shipped across the Atlantic on Liberty ships, and moved through ports cleared of mines and rubble. Rail convoys snaked through liberated Belgium, delivering the machines to forward depots within days. Recovery teams, sometimes working under artillery fire and freezing conditions, salvaged damaged tanks and returned them to combat faster than German engineers could build even a single Panther. The Ardennes, a forest of white snow and blackened steel, became a vivid illustration of this logistical supremacy. For German officers, the psychological impact was as severe as the tactical reality. One report from a Panther commander near Bastogne noted, "We destroy their tanks and yet they multiply. It is as if the forest itself gives birth to armored beasts." The shock was not merely at the numbers but at the predictability and reliability of the American system. Unlike Germany, where production slowed under bombing raids and material shortages, the U.S. industrial engine seemed impervious. Every loss inflicted by the Germans was mitigated almost immediately, undermining morale and eroding the sense of strategic initiative. The Americans' approach was methodical. Frontline commanders communicated continuously with logistical officers, ensuring that no destroyed Sherman remained out of action longer than necessary. Tanks were repaired in field depots or, when irreparable, replaced with fresh machines from rear units. The speed of this system, 500 tanks replaced in a single week, was more than a numerical advantage. It was a demonstration of organizational mastery. German planners who had once relied on surprise, superior engineering, and tactical ingenuity now faced an immutable truth. Sheer industrial output had become a decisive weapon. By early January 1945, the Ardennes offensive had reached its apex and then began to falter. German forces, exhausted and low on fuel and ammunition, were unable to maintain momentum. Meanwhile, American units, reinforced by newly delivered Shermans and repaired vehicles, launched counterattacks with renewed vigor. Towns lost in the initial German surge were retaken. Roads cleared of wreckage allowed supply convoys to reach forward positions efficiently, keeping the American offensive fluid. The strategic initiative shifted irreversibly. The cumulative effect on German command was profound. Field reports, intelligence intercepts, and personal diaries from officers reveal repeated astonishment. Even when destruction of enemy armor reached unprecedented levels, the Americans' capacity to replace it rendered such victories temporary. The psychological weight of this realization was crushing. Tactics and bravery could no longer secure lasting advantage. The Ardennes became a battlefield dominated not solely by strategy or courage, but by the relentless rhythm of production, transportation, and repair. This turning point underscored a fundamental shift in modern warfare. It was no longer enough to excel in combat. Victory depended equally on the capacity to sustain, replace, and reinforce forces faster than the enemy could destroy them. For the German officers witnessing the Ardennes campaign, the replacement of 500 tanks in a single week was a revelation that redefined the parameters of military power. Their shock was not born of defeat alone, but of the recognition that an entire nation's industrial machine could outmatch even the most skilled and determined army. As the American counteroffensive pressed forward in January, the Ardennes forests, once echoing with the roar of German tanks, now bore witness to the resilience of the Allied forces. Each Sherman that returned to the line reinforced a simple yet devastating reality. Industrial capacity could dictate the rhythm of battle, overcome tactical losses, and shape the outcome of war itself. The Germans had faced many challenges on the battlefield, but none as relentless or transformative as the unstoppable tide of American production. The shock felt by German officers would resonate far beyond the Ardennes, becoming a defining lesson for military historians and strategists alike. In a war of men and machines, it was the combination of logistics, production, and repair, an invisible, relentless engine, that proved decisive. From the wreckage of the Ardennes, one truth emerged unmistakably. The battlefield had evolved, and those who could outproduce and outreplace the enemy held the ultimate advantage. By mid-January 1945, the Ardennes offensive had collapsed. German forces, exhausted, undersupplied, and facing relentless American counterattacks, were forced to retreat. The battlefield, once littered with wrecked Shermans and scattered German armor, was gradually cleared and repaired. Roads were reopened, towns rebuilt, and forward supply depots restocked. The American capacity to replace destroyed tanks had not only blunted the German offensive but had also restored strategic initiative in a matter of days. The scale of production and replacement became clear when historians later reviewed the numbers. During the initial stages of the Battle of the Bulge, American units lost approximately 600 tanks. Yet within a single week, nearly 500 were replaced with additional reinforcements arriving shortly after. German commanders had anticipated that such losses would cripple the U.S. armored divisions. But the reality was starkly different. The battlefield was no longer a simple measure of who destroyed more tanks. It had become a test of which side could sustain operations under attrition. For the Germans, the consequences were severe. The failure of the Ardennes offensive drained manpower, depleted fuel and ammunition reserves, and destroyed morale in elite units. Panzer divisions, which had once been the backbone of blitzkrieg, were now reduced in operational strength. Their impact diminished. Field reports indicate officers struggled to comprehend how tactical brilliance could be negated so completely by an opponent's industrial capacity. The realization that the Americans could replace nearly all lost armor within days was a psychological blow as significant as any battlefield defeat. The Americans, by contrast, had validated the doctrine of industrial warfare. Factories continued to produce tanks, trucks, artillery, and ammunition at unprecedented rates. Field units were reinforced, supply lines remained open despite winter conditions, and repair teams restored damaged vehicles with speed and efficiency. The ability to maintain operational strength despite significant losses transformed American strategy. The battlefield became a demonstration of systemic superiority. The combination of production, logistics, and tactical deployment ensured that temporary setbacks never became strategic failures. Reports from the front highlight a consistent pattern. German forces would achieve temporary tactical successes, yet these were swiftly nullified. In one example, a German Tiger battalion destroyed over 50 Shermans in a single engagement. Within 3 days, replacement tanks arrived, accompanied by fresh crews and artillery support. By the time German forces attempted to press the advantage, the Americans had not only recovered but also prepared counterattacks. The speed of replacement turned localized victories into ephemeral gains, frustrating German officers and forcing reconsideration of operational plans. This phase of the war underscored the widening gap between German and Allied capabilities. While German tanks were technologically superior, the inability to replace losses rapidly meant that even decisive engagements could not shift the strategic balance. Conversely, the U.S. Army, supported by a vast industrial base, demonstrated that operational endurance and production capacity were as critical to victory as battlefield skill. The Ardennes had become a vivid example. Destruction alone was insufficient when the enemy could replace, repair, and reinforce at an unprecedented pace. The aftermath of the Ardennes offensive illuminated the stark realities of industrial warfare. German commanders, once confident that a concentrated attack could destabilize the Allies, faced the undeniable truth. The Americans had turned production into a weapon as formidable as any tank or artillery piece. By February 1945, records showed that the United States had produced over 1,200 tanks in the final months of 1944 alone, a figure that dwarfed German output even at peak capacity. In comparison, Germany struggled to produce a few hundred Panthers and Tigers per month, hampered by Allied bombing campaigns, fuel shortages, and labor constraints. The numerical disparity alone had strategic consequences, but the true advantage lay in speed and reliability. American logistical efficiency ensured that replacements reached the front lines without delay. Field depots were stocked with spare parts, engines, and turret assemblies, allowing even damaged Shermans to return to combat within days. Recovery units retrieved knocked-out vehicles from snow-filled craters and forested ravines, turning once-lost machines into functional assets. The Germans could destroy tanks, but each kill was temporary, a fleeting victory that left no lasting mark on the overall balance of power. The battlefield had shifted from a contest of tactics to a contest of endurance, coordination, and industrial output. The psychological impact on German officers was profound. Diaries and intelligence reports reveal a recurring sense of disbelief. Victories measured in destroyed American armor did not translate into strategic advantage. Lieutenant Colonel Richter, reflecting on the offensive, later noted the frustration that defined the campaign. "We had won the fights, yet the enemy's strength remained. Each Sherman we felled returned to the field like a specter." This sentiment captured a broader realization within the Wehrmacht that even elite units were constrained by Germany's diminishing industrial base. No matter the skill or bravery displayed on the battlefield, American forces could sustain, recover, and counterattack with an efficiency Germany could not match. The Ardennes also highlighted the importance of integrated planning between production and combat operations. The U.S. military's ability to align factory output, transport networks, field depots, and combat units created a seamless flow of material power to the front. Every loss incurred by American forces was anticipated, accounted for, and mitigated. In contrast, the German army had no equivalent system. Tactical brilliance was often undermined by logistical shortcomings, leaving units stranded, undersupplied, and vulnerable to counterattacks. The disparity between German expectations and American reality was a defining factor in the failure of the offensive. Strategically, the ability to replace 500 tanks in a single week had long-term implications. It demonstrated that Germany could no longer achieve decisive results through local tactical success. Battles, no matter how skillfully executed, could not offset the industrial and logistical imbalance. The Allies' capacity to sustain and reinforce their armored forces meant that Germany faced an unyielding adversary whose momentum could never be fully halted. The Ardennes thus became a turning point not just tactically, but psychologically and operationally. The German High Command had confronted a new kind of warfare, where industrial might dictated the pace and outcome of engagements. By the end of January 1945, the Ardennes forest had been cleared of German forces. American units pressed forward, re-establishing defensive lines and preparing for the final push into Germany. The battlefield, though scarred by snow, fire, and steel, now stood as a testament to the transformative power of production and logistics. The replacement of 500 tanks in just 1 week had shifted the calculus of war, ensuring that the Germans' tactical achievements were rendered momentary. The Ardennes had proven that in modern conflict, the strength of a nation's factories could rival and even surpass the skill of its soldiers and commanders. The Ardennes offensive, and the shock it inflicted upon German officers, stands as a defining moment in the history of modern warfare. Here, the battlefield became more than a clash of men and machines. It became a stage for industrial power itself. The ability of the United States to replace 500 tanks in a single week revealed a truth that extended far beyond the Ardennes. In the industrial age, victory is as much about production, logistics, and organization as it is about courage, strategy, or technology. The Sherman tanks that returned to the front were not just machines. They were symbols of a nation's capacity to convert steel, labor, and ingenuity into decisive military force. For the Germans, who had prided themselves on technical superiority and battlefield brilliance, this realization was both humbling and terrifying. No longer could tactical victories guarantee strategic advantage. Every destroyed tank, every killed crew was countered by an almost mechanical certainty: replacement, reinforcement, continuation. The Germans faced a new form of warfare, one where the rhythm of industry dictated the pulse of battle. This episode also underscored the human dimension behind industrial warfare. American workers, engineers, logisticians, and field crews contributed directly to outcomes thousands of miles away. Each rivet, each repaired engine, each coordinated convoy reinforced a front that might otherwise have faltered. Victory was no longer solely won on the battlefield. It was built in factories, warehouses, and transport hubs, a quiet yet unstoppable force that reshaped the war's outcome. The lesson for history, and for future generations, is profound. Industrial capacity, when harnessed with precision and foresight, can overwhelm even the most skilled adversary. The Ardennes was more than a failed German offensive. It was a demonstration of a new era in warfare, where strategy, courage, and technology alone could not guarantee success. The astonishment of German officers at America's rapid replacement of 500 tanks in 1 week remains a stark reminder. In modern war, systems can be as decisive as soldiers, and production can be as powerful as firepower. In the quiet aftermath of snow-covered forests, scorched villages, and repaired Sherman tanks rolling once more into the fray, one truth endures: the balance of war had shifted. The Germans had learned too late that the battlefield was no longer simply fought with tactics or skill. It was fought with the relentless, unyielding engine of industry, and that engine had already begun to determine the fate of nations.